are on the front pages as well. The Sunday Times has the story about the John Warboys case. Is that going to a judicial review and be reversed? We'll talk about that later on. The Observer has an interview with Nigel Farage there, in which he says that the Brexit side are losing the argument, and he's beginning to talk again about a second referendum. Really, really interesting. We'll be talking much more about that. Could that be... could he be coming back as leader of UKIP? If so, it might be to do with the story on the front page of the Mail on Sunday, who says that the girlfriend of the current leader of UKIP has said some absolutely disgusting and horrible things about Meghan Markle. She's been suspended, but that is a party clearly still in crisis of some kind or another. And finally, another party, the Conservative Party, this time on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, Tories too shy to fight the left online, warns the chief. We'll be talking to him later on, and that's really about the importance of the Tories getting more effective online, and also, they hope, starting to crack down on the culture of abuse that can appear on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. OK, let's start, Helen, with that Nigel Farage piece on the front page of The Observer.
Yes, Nigel Farage has called for a nationwide debate on why people should listen to Nigel Farage again. I think that's what I'm getting from this story. He says, you know, the Remainers are winning the argument, and maybe perhaps a man could come out of retirement, as it were, to help make this case again. I think it's interesting because I do think there has been a sense that the narrative has really shifted a bit. I mean, Labour's position is deliberately fuzzy because they know that they have voters who support both sides of that argument. It's been kind of essentially a millimetre to the left of whatever the Tory position is. But they are kind of coming around to this idea about maybe staying in the customs union now. And actually, if you look at the communique that was issued when earlier just before Christmas, it said unless they come up with some magic border arrangement, essentially, we're going to have to keep the regulations between the Northern Ireland and South of Ireland very, very similar. So it really feels like actually that the kind of hard Brexit that people wanted is not being delivered.
And so, to be clear, Helen, what Farage is worried about is not that we won't legally leave the EU, but that the way that we leave the EU won't be the kind of Brexit that he always wanted. It's a question of how close to Europe we continue to be.
Exactly, and this has always been the problem with the referendum, is that the ballot paper, you know, asked a very, very simple question, and actually what you take from that is very, very hard. And I think the problem is that really the numbers are not there in Parliament for some of these very, very hard measures.
Andrew, do you think it's true that the Remainers are now winning the argument?
Well, they're certainly making the argument in a way that the Leavers aren't. You've got people like Michael Heseltine, Tony Blair. Heseltine says he will use every bone in his body to try and overturn Brexit. Even though there's been a referendum result in favour of Brexit, he says it doesn't matter, and they are fighting the good fight. When it goes to the House of Lords, of course, Brexit's going to be in a lot of trouble because there are so many Remainers on the Conservative side, people like Heseltine, Baroness Wheatcroft, who will do everything they can to try and scupper it.
So Farage back into the fight. Do you think Henry Bolton, the current UKIP leader, can survive?
No. And this extraordinary story in the Mail on Sunday about his girlfriend, who's 25, Jo Marley, who's made some really appalling racist remarks about Meghan Markle. He's up before his national executive on Thursday. She's been suspended. How can they continue with a leader who is dating a woman who's made such appalling insults about Meghan Markle?
So maybe that's part of the reason that Remain are winning the argument at the moment, that a party like UKIP is in such trouble.
I think UKIP is absolutely finished, and I think what we know really is it was a one-man band. It was Nigel Farage, and unless he chooses to come back, and he tells me last time I spoke to him he ain't coming back, he doesn't want to do it anymore, I think UKIP are finished. They've got no money, no support, and they're not making the case on Brexit either.
But what's really interesting is one of the reasons he talks about the reason he might come back and have a second referendum is to settle the question. Now, if we can think of anything that would not settle the question of Europe, it's having another referendum. And what you say is absolutely true, which is, you know, I've grown up in politics where Leavers felt absolutely passionately about Europe, and no one ever made the case for Europe. And what's happened because of the referendum is you've ended up with ardent Remainers, people who really, really care pro-European.
A shift in sentiment. You can see that all over the place. It's
I think that's really fascinating.
Absolutely right. Let's move on to one of the other big stories of the day, which is the Warboys case, which is on the front page of the Sunday Times above all. And this is the new Justice Secretary saying that he is trying to get a legal review of the decision to release Warboys. Why is this happening, do you think, Helen?
Well, I think the problem is, really, it stems back to the fact that he was prosecuted over 12 cases, and the assumption is that there are many, many more. I think 93 allegations that weren't tested in court. And I think that when you look at that, people feel this is somebody who is absolutely a repeat offender. They find it very difficult to believe in the idea of rehabilitation, that someone is now safe to release. I find it a difficult story because, you know, you can't see the parole board's reasoning, right? That is the problem.
And they're not allowed, they say, by their terms of reference, to tell us why they're releasing war boys. But I'm amazed that he wasn't prosecuted for those other cases. When you consider the historic cases that were Jimmy Savile, the guy who died in prison recently.
I think it's also very difficult for Theresa May.
In the Observer that one of the reasons that he was released is that a psychologist hired by the defence team, by his own team, was given undue prominence in the decision.
Yeah, and I think David Gauke has to get this right, because I think that public opinion is really appalled by the idea war boys should be released. They were appalled by the fact he only got 8 or 9 years in prison in the first place. It's what they call an indeterminate sentence, which are being abolished. But it's
also a case that I think we could learn from a lot, because some of these women were laughed at essentially when they came into the police, and we see here so much about rape being not taken seriously, not prosecuted properly, and I hope if a case like this ever happens again, it will be treated in a completely different way.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll certainly be talking to Brandon Lewis, the new Tory chairman, about all of this, which takes us to the front page of the Sunday Telegraph.
Well, he's given an interview to the Sunday Telegraph. What he wanted to talk about mainly was the fact he says the trolling and the abuse of public figures is right at the very top of the Labour Party. He's talking about John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, who said of Esther McVeigh, the new Work and Pension Secretary, lynch the bitch. But the Sunday Telegraph have gone in on the fact...
To be fair to him, I should say that he says he was repeating something that was being said by other people.
I think he used a different B word, actually, not a feminine one. But anyway, yeah, it's a very complicated case.
But whatever it was deeply unpleasant. Yeah. But what the Telegraph are going on is the fact that Brandon Lewis says the Tories have completely lost the war on social media, and they have to engage with the voters on social media. But the Telegraph, in its editorial, says that's all very well, but you've got to have something to engage with. Where are the policies? Where are the retail policies? Where are the policies to attract people under the age of 35? So far, there are none.
Now, it's quite remarkable that we've been talking all this time and we haven't even mentioned the reshuffle, Helen. It didn't go quite as it was supposed to do. I think Ian Martin's on your...
yeah, and he has I think this is now quite a common opinion on the reshuffle, is what you might have expected from this reshuffle is a few people, a few rising stars, promoted very rapidly to really see what they can do. The name Dominic Raab comes up a lot about, you know, somebody who was a Brexiteer and on the right, and he's actually ended up with housing, but as a Minister of State rather than a full cabinet role. And that is not the actions of somebody who is grooming the next generation and really giving everyone a chance to kind of kick their tyres. So the assumption, and Dan Hodges shares it in the Mail on Sunday, is that actually she sees herself there for as long as she possibly can. She's not keen to get the next generation through and out.
And she didn't appoint a new First Secretary of State, a de facto deputy, which she had in Damien Green, who she never saw as a threat. Jeremy Hunt was widely thought to be getting that job. She didn't give him the job. Was that because she sees him as a threat? And the reshuffle was supposed to be all about inclusivity, but they ended up with one less gay person in the cabinet and no more ethnic faces.
Look, I think the really big problem about the reshuffle as well is it was both too cautious and also too disruptive. You end up with this incredible level of churn. The entire cabinet office has all new ministers.
And lots of people said to the Prime Minister, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do something else. Jeremy Hunt said, no, I'm not going to leave health, I'd like social security as well.
And 4 ministers at the DWP since 2016, since Ian Duncan Smith left. How do you deliver those big policies?
Let's move on, if you don't mind, to another really big story this week, which is Donald Trump not coming to Britain. And there's a piece here in the Sunday Times saying the reason he didn't come was nothing to do with the embassy being in South London, which was the excuse he gave, but that he was feeling too little love from the British people.
He's not adored enough, and the Sunday Times is reporting there actually that plans were fairly well advanced for him to have lunch at Buckingham Palace with the Queen, which I think he'd have really enjoyed. But the Sunday Times is saying he now thinks that Theresa May's government regards him in exactly the same way as Sadiq Khan, who made the Mayor of London, who made it absolutely clear he doesn't want Trump to come to Britain.
So this is a problem for Theresa May and for the government in big terms, because the whole Brexit strategy depends upon us getting this big, generous, open treaty with America, which means with Donald Trump.
And Obama, of course, famously said when he came here, rather ill-advised, I think, Britain will be at the back of the queue for a trade deal. Donald Trump said the absolute reverse. But if, as the Sunday Times reports, he now thinks the May government regards him in such a low light, that's not very good for the trade deal, which we need.
I don't feel that dismayed about it, because I don't think Donald Trump knows what he thinks from one day to the next. So, to be honest with you, I think the chances of getting...
He'll change his mind in a few weeks'
time. A good
time.
trade deal were always very, very slim.
OK, let's talk about 2 other stories very, very quickly. We talked about dry January, V-January, Veganuary, I don't know how you say it.
Awful. Not for me.
Not even, what, dry January or veganuary?
Dry January ended on January the 6th, I'm afraid, for me,
so
sadly.
Veganuary is we all go vegan in January is the idea. And London has its first vegan pub.
I know something that unfortunately Donald Trump will not be able to sample as he's now not coming over here. I'm sure he's a big vegan. But I think this is really fascinating. You know, lots of people I work in my office are already vegetarians. I think that's becoming a really, really common thing, and particularly among younger people. It's incredibly good for the planet. However, the problem with going vegan has always been that you essentially have to have a sort of completely separate special menu, and basically people kind of hand you an aubergine when you go to a restaurant, and that's all you get.
If you're lucky.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good thing. Why not?
I'm not going.
As long as I can have an all-meat restaurant,
even if I get invited to Fish Lake, I'm not going to a vegan restaurant or pub. I think you want
Stick
a
to your
pint. You want a pint of beer and a pie.
Well, let's turn to somebody else who probably likes a pint of beer or pie occasionally, the Queen herself.
Fabulous.
Very, very interesting. She has not given an interview to the BBC.
No.
He said, slightly tartly, as somebody who's always wanted to interview her, and I'm told she never gives an interview, but she has had a conversation.
That's exactly how they're spinning this. It's Alistair Bruce, the royal historian. He's done a great job, a great conversation with the Queen, because it's not an interview, and they've discovered in the Royal Archive the letter she wrote describing her father's coronation when she was 11, and she writes it to Mummy and Papa in memory of their coronation from Lilibet by herself. How sweet is that? Very charming.
A lot of people will be watching that,
Glued to it. I'll be glued to it.
We have cracked through an awful lot of stories in a great short space of time. Thank you both very much indeed. So to the weather.